What happened when bikers attacks at fat black woman? If this story touched your heart, like, subscribe and share. A fearless Marine and his strong, compassionate wife stand up to hate and build a legacy of love. This is the inspiring tale of Maggie and Marcus, two ordinary people who faced extraordinary challenges and turned their pain into purpose. A quiet afternoon in a small town takes a terrifying turn, and a woman's strength is tested in ways she never imagined. Maggie Thompson, a warm-hearted, plus-sized woman with a laugh that could light up a room, was walking home from the local market. Her arms were full of groceries, and her mind was on the dinner she'd promised to make for her husband, Marcus, who was due back from his latest deployment. But she carried herself with a quiet dignity, her head held high, her heart full of love for the life she'd built. As she turned the corner onto Maple Street, the rumble of motorcycles broke the calm. A group of bikers, their leather jackets adorned with patches that screamed trouble, rolled into view. Maggie's stomach tightened. She'd seen them around before, their sneers and muttered slurs a constant reminder that not everyone in Willow Creek was as welcoming as she'd hoped. But she kept walking, her steps steady, her eyes forward. "Hey, big girl," one of them called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "You sure you should be eating all that?" The others laughed, their voices sharp and cruel. Maggie's cheeks burned, but she didn't stop. She'd heard it all before. But then one of them revved his engine, pulling his bike onto the sidewalk, blocking her path. Maggie froze, her heart pounding. "What's the matter?" he sneered, stepping off his bike. "Too good to talk to us?" The air grew thick with tension as the other bikers dismounted, forming a loose circle around her. Maggie's mind raced. She thought of Marcus, his steady voice, his unwavering strength. She thought of the life they'd built together, the love that had carried them through every challenge. And then she thought of herself, her own strength, her own worth. "Leave me alone," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. The leader of the group, a man with cold eyes and a cruel smile, stepped closer. "Or what?" he taunted. "What are you gonna do, huh?" Maggie's hands tightened around her grocery bags. She wouldn't back down. She couldn't. But just as the man reached out to grab her arm, a voice cut through the air like a knife. "Touch her, and you'll regret it." The bikers turned, their smirks fading as they saw the man standing at the edge of the circle. Marcus Thompson, Maggie's husband, was a mountain of a man, broad-shouldered, with a gaze that could freeze hell over. His Marine Corps tattoo peeked out from under his sleeve, a silent reminder of the battles he'd fought, the strength he carried. The bikers hesitated, their bravado faltering. But the leader, too proud to back down, squared his shoulders. "This doesn't concern you, buddy," he spat. Marcus took a step forward, his presence alone enough to make the bikers take a step back. "You're messing with my wife," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "That makes it my concern." The air crackled with tension as the bikers exchanged uneasy glances. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected him. Maggie's heart swelled as she looked at Marcus, her protector, her partner, her love. But she also knew this wasn't just about him. It was about her, too. She stepped forward, standing beside Marcus, her chin lifted, her eyes blazing. "You don't get to intimidate me," she said, her voice strong. "Not today. Not ever." The bikers, outmatched and outnumbered, muttered curses under their breath as they backed away, their bravado crumbling. They mounted their bikes and roared off, leaving behind a silence that felt louder than their engines. Marcus turned to Maggie, his eyes softening as he pulled her into his arms. "You okay?" he asked, his voice gentle now, filled with love. Maggie nodded, her heart still racing but her spirit unbroken. "I am now," she said, leaning into his embrace. As they walked home together, the sun dipping below the horizon, Maggie felt a sense of pride she hadn't expected. She'd stood her ground, faced her fears, and shown the world that she was more than the labels others tried to put on her. And with Marcus by her side, she knew there was nothing they couldn't face together. But little did they know, this was just the beginning. The bikers wouldn't forget what happened today, and neither would Maggie. The quiet streets of Willow Creek held more secrets than anyone realized, and the strength of one woman, and the love of one man, would be tested in ways they never imagined. What happens when the world tries to break you, and you discover just how strong you really are? For Maggie and Marcus, the answer was just beginning to unfold. The days that followed were anything but ordinary. Maggie couldn't shake the unease that lingered after the confrontation with the bikers. It wasn't just the way they'd looked at her. It was the way they'd looked at Marcus, like they were sizing him up, calculating their next move. She tried to push the thoughts aside, focusing on the simple joys of her life, the smell of fresh coffee in the morning, the sound of Marcus's laughter as he told her stories from his time overseas, the way the sunlight streamed through the kitchen window as she cooked. But the tension was there, simmering beneath the surface, waiting to boil over. Willow Creek was a town where everyone knew everyone, but it was also a place where secrets festered. The bikers weren't just passing through. They were part of something bigger, something darker. Maggie had heard whispers at the market, snippets of conversations that hinted at trouble. The bikers were tied to a local gang, one that had been growing bolder, pushing their way into businesses, demanding protection money, and leaving a trail of fear in their wake. No one dared to stand up to them. No one except Marcus. Marcus had always been a man of action. He'd seen the worst of humanity during his time as a Marine, but he'd also seen the best, the resilience, the courage, the unbreakable spirit of those who refused to back down. He'd promised Maggie he'd keep her safe, and he meant it. But he also knew that safety wasn't just about physical protection. It was about standing up for what was right, even when it was hard, even when it was dangerous. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set, Marcus turned to Maggie, his expression serious. "We can't let this go," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Those men, they're not just bullies. They're predators. And if we don't do something, they'll keep coming back. They'll keep hurting people." Maggie's heart ached as she looked at him. She knew he was right, but the thought of him putting himself in harm's way terrified her. "Marcus, you're not in the Marines anymore," she said softly. "You don't have to fight every battle." He reached for her hand, his grip warm and reassuring. "This isn't about being a Marine," he said. "It's about being a decent human being. It's about protecting the people we love. And Maggie, I love this town. I love our life here. I'm not going to let anyone take that away from us." Maggie swallowed hard, her eyes filling with tears. She knew there was no talking him out of it. Marcus was a man of principle, and once he set his mind to something, there was no stopping him. "Just promise me you'll be careful," she whispered. He smiled, that slow, easy smile that always made her heart skip a beat. "Always," he said. The next morning, Marcus went to the local sheriff's office. Sheriff Daniels was a good man, but he was overwhelmed. The gang had been a thorn in his side for years, and he didn't have the resources to take them down. When Marcus walked in and offered his help, the sheriff hesitated. "This isn't your fight, Marcus," he said. "These guys are dangerous. They don't play by the rules." "Neither do I," Marcus replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. Together, they began to piece together a plan. Marcus used his military training to gather intel, mapping out the gang's operations, identifying their weak spots. He reached out to other veterans in the area, men and women who understood the value of standing up for what was right. Slowly but surely, a network of allies began to form, a quiet resistance determined to take back their town. But the gang wasn't going down without a fight. One night, as Marcus and Maggie were getting ready for bed, the sound of shattering glass echoed through the house. Marcus was on his feet in an instant, his instincts kicking in. He grabbed the baseball bat he kept by the door and motioned for Maggie to stay back. "Call the sheriff," he said, his voice low and urgent. Maggie's hands trembled as she dialed the number, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear voices outside, angry and menacing. The bikers had come back, and this time they weren't just looking to intimidate. They were looking for revenge. Marcus stepped outside, his jaw clenched, his grip tight on the bat. The leader of the gang stood in the driveway, a smirk on his face. "Thought you could mess with us, huh?" he sneered. "Big mistake." Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to make the men hesitate. But they were armed, and they were desperate. The fight that followed was brutal and chaotic. Marcus moved with the precision of a trained soldier, his years of experience giving him the upper hand. But he was outnumbered, and the odds were against him. Inside the house, Maggie watched in horror, her phone still pressed to her ear. She could hear the sheriff's voice on the other end, telling her to stay calm, that help was on the way. But all she could think about was Marcus, out there alone, risking everything to protect her, to protect their home. And then, just as it seemed like the gang might overpower him, the sound of sirens filled the air. The sheriff and his deputies arrived, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness. The bikers scattered, their bravado crumbling in the face of law enforcement. Marcus stood in the driveway, bloodied but unbowed, his chest heaving as he watched them flee. Maggie ran to him, tears streaming down her face. "You're okay," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're okay." Marcus pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "We're okay," he said, "and we're not going to let them win. Not now. Not ever." The days that followed were a blur. The gang was dismantled, their operations exposed, their leaders arrested. The town of Willow Creek began to heal, the shadow of fear lifting as people found the courage to stand together. Marcus became a hero, not just to Maggie, but to everyone who called the town home. But for Maggie, the real victory wasn't in the arrests or the headlines. It was in the quiet moments, the way Marcus held her hand as they walked through the market, the way he smiled at her across the dinner table, the way he looked at her like she was the most beautiful thing in the world. It was in the knowledge that they had faced the storm together and come out stronger on the other side. As the sun set over Willow Creek, casting a warm glow over the streets, Maggie and Marcus sat on their porch, side by side. The world was far from perfect, but in that moment it was enough. They had each other. They had their home. And they had the strength to face whatever came next. What happens when love and courage collide, and two people refuse to back down? For Maggie and Marcus, the answer was simple. They stood tall, together, and showed the world what it meant to be unbreakable. The town of Willow Creek breathed easier after the gang was dismantled. The streets felt safer, the air lighter, and the people began to reclaim the sense of community that had been stolen from them. But for Maggie and Marcus, life wasn't just about moving on, it was about moving forward. They had faced the darkness together, and now they were determined to build something brighter. Maggie had always been the heart of their home, the one who kept everything running smoothly. But after everything that had happened, she felt a fire ignite within her, a desire to do more, to be more. She started volunteering at the local community center, organizing events and programs to bring people together. She wanted to show others that they didn't have to face their struggles alone, that there was strength in unity. Marcus, meanwhile, found himself in a new role, one he hadn't expected but embraced wholeheartedly. The veterans he'd rallied to help take down the gang had formed a tight-knit group, and they began meeting regularly to support one another. They shared stories, offered advice, and worked on projects to improve the town. Marcus became a leader among them, not because he sought the title, but because they trusted him. He had a way of making people feel seen, heard, and valued. One evening, as Maggie and Marcus sat on their porch, sipping tea and watching the stars, Maggie turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever think about how much we've been through?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with wonder. "I mean, we've faced so much, and yet here we are, still standing, still together." Marcus smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Every day," he said, "and every day, I'm grateful for you. You're the reason I keep going, Maggie. You're my strength." Maggie's heart swelled at his words, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more they could do. "What if we could help others find that kind of strength?" she asked. "What if we could show them that no matter how hard life gets, they're not alone?" Marcus tilted his head, studying her. "What are you thinking?" She took a deep breath, her mind racing with ideas. "What if we started a foundation? Something to help people in our community, veterans, families, anyone who's struggling. We could offer support, resources, a place to belong. We've been through so much, Marcus. Maybe it's time we use that to make a difference." Marcus was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Then he nodded, a slow, determined smile spreading across his face. "Let's do it," he said. "Let's build something that lasts." The next few months were a whirlwind of activity. Maggie and Marcus poured their hearts into the foundation, naming it Unbroken as a testament to the resilience they'd seen in themselves and others. They reached out to local businesses, community leaders, and volunteers, and the response was overwhelming. People wanted to help, to be part of something bigger than themselves. The Foundation's first project was a community garden, a place where people could come together to grow fresh produce, share stories, and find solace in nature. Maggie spent hours planting seeds and tending to the soil, her hands dirty but her heart full. Marcus worked alongside her, his strength and determination inspiring everyone who joined them. But the garden was just the beginning. They organized workshops on mental health, financial literacy, and job skills. They hosted events to celebrate the town's diversity and bring people together. And they created a safe space for veterans to connect, share their experiences, and find support. One day, as Maggie stood in the garden, watching a group of children laugh and play, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. This was what it was all about, this sense of connection, of hope, of possibility. She turned to Marcus, who was helping a young veteran plant a row of tomatoes, and felt a surge of love and pride. "We did this," she said softly, more to herself than anyone else. "We built this." Marcus looked up, catching her eye. He smiled, that slow, easy smile that always made her heart skip a beat. "No, Maggie," he said. "We're building this. Together." And he was right. The foundation was more than just a project. It was a movement. It was a reminder that no matter how hard life gets, there is always hope. That no matter how broken we feel, we can find the strength to heal. And that when we stand together, we are unbreakable. The foundation, unbroken, became the heartbeat of Willow Creek. It wasn't just a place. It was a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest times, light could break through. Maggie and Marcus poured their souls into it, and the community responded in kind. People who had once felt invisible now had a place to belong. Veterans who had struggled to find their footing after returning home found purpose in the garden and the workshops. Families who had been torn apart by hardship found support and connection. The town was healing, one small act of kindness at a time. But life, as it always does, had more in store for them. One crisp autumn morning, as Maggie was organizing a new batch of donations at the community center, she noticed a young woman sitting alone in the corner. She looked tired, her shoulders slumped, her eyes hollow. Maggie's heart ached as she approached her, sensing the weight of unspoken pain. "Hi there," Maggie said gently, sitting down beside her. "I'm Maggie. What's your name?" The woman hesitated, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. "Lila," she finally whispered. I didn't know where else to go." Maggie reached out, placing a hand on Lila's arm. "You're in the right place," she said. "Whatever you're going through, you don't have to face it alone." Lila's story came pouring out in fragments: a lost job, an eviction notice, a child to care for. She had been living in her car, too ashamed to ask for help. Maggie listened, her heart breaking with every word. But she also felt a fierce determination rising within her. This was why they had built Unbroken. This was why they fought so hard. "We're going to help you," Maggie said firmly. "You're not alone anymore, Lila. We've got you." Marcus was by her side in an instant, his calm presence a steadying force. Together they worked to find Lila and her child a safe place to stay, connecting her with resources and support. It wasn't an easy process, but Maggie and Marcus didn't give up. They never did. As the weeks passed, Lila began to find her footing. She joined the community garden, her hands finding solace in the soil. She attended workshops, her confidence growing with each new skill she learned. And she found friendship in the people around her, people who understood her struggles and celebrated her victories. One day, as Lila stood in the garden, her child laughing beside her, she turned to Maggie with tears in her eyes. "You saved us," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to thank you." Maggie shook her head, her own eyes filling with tears. "You don't have to thank me," she said. "This is what we're here for. To lift each other up. To remind each other that we're not alone." But even as they celebrated Lila's progress, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to be done. The need in their community was greater than they had realized, and Unbroken was just the beginning. She shared her thoughts with Marcus one evening as they sat on their porch, the stars twinkling above them. "What if we expanded?" she asked, her voice filled with quiet determination. "What if we reached out to other towns, other communities? We've seen what's possible here. Imagine what we could do if we took this further." Marcus was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Then he nodded, a slow, steady smile spreading across his face. "Let's do it," he said. "Let's take this as far as we can." The next few months were a whirlwind of planning and preparation. Maggie and Marcus reached out to neighboring towns, sharing their story and their vision. The response was overwhelming. People wanted to be part of something bigger, something that made a difference. Unbroken began to grow, its reach expanding far beyond Willow Creek. But with growth came challenges. There were moments of doubt, moments when the weight of it all felt too heavy to bear. There were setbacks and obstacles, times when it seemed like the world was against them. But through it all, Maggie and Marcus held on to each other, their love and determination unwavering. One evening, as they stood in the garden, watching the sun set over the horizon, Maggie turned to Marcus with a smile. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" she said, her voice filled with wonder. Marcus nodded, his eyes soft with love. "We have," he said, "and we're just getting started." What happens when two people refuse to give up, when they pour their hearts into something bigger than themselves? For Maggie and Marcus, the answer was clear. They create a legacy of hope, one that touches countless lives and reminds us all that we are stronger together. And as they stood there, hand in hand, watching the world they had helped build, they knew that their story was far from over. It was just beginning. The expansion of Unbroken was both exhilarating and exhausting. Maggie and Marcus found themselves traveling to neighboring towns, meeting with community leaders, and sharing their story with anyone who would listen. They spoke in church basements, school auditoriums, and town halls, their message always the same: no one should have to face their struggles alone. And slowly but surely, their vision began to take root in new places. But as Unbroken grew, so did the demands on their time and energy. Maggie often found herself awake late into the night, poring over spreadsheets and grant applications. Marcus, ever the steady force, took on the logistical challenges, coordinating volunteers and resources across multiple locations. They were a team, as they had always been, but the weight of it all began to take its toll. One evening, after a particularly long day, Maggie collapsed onto the couch, her head in her hands. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's too much, Marcus. What if we're not enough?" Marcus sat down beside her, his presence a calming anchor. He didn't offer empty reassurances or quick fixes. Instead, he took her hand and said, "We don't have to do it all, Maggie. We just have to do what we can. And we don't have to do it alone." His words struck a chord. Maggie realized they had been so focused on helping others that they had forgotten to ask for help themselves. The next morning, they called a meeting with their core team: volunteers, veterans, and community leaders who had become like family. They shared their struggles, their fears, and their hopes. And to their surprise, the response was overwhelming. "You've carried this for so long," one of the volunteers said. "Let us help you carry it now." With the support of their team, Maggie and Marcus began to delegate responsibilities, trusting others to take the reins. It wasn't easy. They were used to being in control, to doing everything themselves. But as they stepped back, they saw something incredible happen. The foundation began to thrive in ways they hadn't imagined. New ideas emerged, fresh energy infused their projects, and the sense of community grew stronger than ever. One of the most powerful moments came during a regional Unbroken event, where people from different towns gathered to share their stories and celebrate their progress. Maggie stood on stage, looking out at the sea of faces, and felt a lump rise in her throat. These were people who had been broken, who had faced unimaginable challenges, and yet here they were, stronger, braver, and more united than ever. "This," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "is what it means to be unbroken. It's not about never falling. It's about getting back up, again and again, and knowing that you don't have to do it alone." The crowd erupted into applause, but Maggie's eyes found Marcus in the front row. He was smiling, his eyes filled with pride and love. In that moment, she knew they had done something extraordinary. They had created a movement, a ripple of hope that was spreading far beyond what they could have imagined. But even as they celebrated their successes, Maggie and Marcus never lost sight of what mattered most: the people. They continued to show up, to listen, to offer a hand or a hug when it was needed. They knew that Unbroken wasn't just about programs or projects. It was about connection, about reminding people that they mattered. One day, as they walked through the garden in Willow Creek, Maggie turned to Marcus with a smile. "Do you remember when this was just an idea?" she asked. "When it was just the two of us, dreaming about what could be?" Marcus nodded, his hand tightening around hers. "I remember," he said. "And look at what we've built. Together. What happens when love, courage, and community come together?" For Maggie and Marcus, the answer was clear. They create a legacy of hope, one that touches countless lives and reminds us all that we are stronger together. And as they stood there, hand in hand, watching the world they had helped build, they knew that their story was far from over. It was just beginning.